So my name is Dimitris Liokaftos, and what I'll try and do today is propose a framework, or at least the outline of a framework, for a sociological analysis of microdosing psychedelics. I think sociology happens to be in the minority compared to other disciplines as far as psychedelics research is concerned. So I thought perhaps you guys might be interested in hearing some suggestions about how to approach the phenomenon from a sociological perspective. And what I'm going to propose is not, of course, the only possible way. It's just something that comes out of my previous work on human enhancement drugs. And then I'll be talking a little bit also about some actual data analysis that's coming out of a limited pilot study that I've done recently at the Mind Foundation, focusing on mainstream media representations of microdosing. Okay, so to begin with, what I researched for my doctoral thesis was the historical development of bodybuilding, and male bodybuilding in particular. And what I tried to do was kind of propose a genealogy of bodybuilding, which I called From Classical to Freaky. I tried to figure out how we have come from this. So that's when bodybuilding first appeared, last decades of the 19th century, to this. Okay, so within a period of 120 years, approximately, I wanted to make sense of that transformation. So we begin with an ideal that was celebrating the notion of the classical or the natural body. So back then, bodybuilding was very much almost a kind of natural therapy of sorts against the problems that modern civilization creates for human bodies, and particularly in urban centers. But as time goes by and then different things change, and I guess the one argument that I tried to present in that work was that instead of thinking of this as a kind of linear progression of things, as people within bodybuilding think of it today, we should be rather talking about different paradigms of human development. And so different ways of thinking about the body, about the aesthetics of the body, about how people are relating to their bodies, and what are the things that they are trying to express through practicing with their bodies. And of course, the use of drugs such as anabolic steroids was a key aspect of that image. But just the fact that the drugs existed and they were created in a lab setting was not enough of an explanation as to why they started being used and in that particular context. So what I tried to do was kind of produce a historical narrative that explained the use of these drugs within bodybuilding. So some of the findings that human enhancement drugs, they were initially adopted within experimental subcultures. In my case, it was elite bodybuilding. So you have people like Schwarzenegger, that probably most of you know, in the 60s and 70s, having this frame of mind within a kind of closed user community of being at the avant-garde, at the very forefront of progress through elite sport and elite competitions. And in the 80s and 90s, we see a diffusion of these practices into wider populations. You also have very particular discourses around this use of drugs. So you have a lot of talk back in the 70s around human potential. So there's what John Hoberman has called the human potential movement of the 60s and 70s. And in some ways, bodybuilding and the use of anabolic steroids is part of that. West Coast, USA, and ideas around self-development, around trying to see where you can take your body, what are the limits of the human body. So that's a kind of larger framework for that. But also, I thought it was quite reflective, these changes were quite reflective of wider social phenomena and processes. For example, shifts in male identities. Okay, so what it means to be a man, what is the relations of men to their bodies, what they're trying to do with their bodies, express with their bodies, but also things like processes like the professionalization and mediatization in sport and popular culture. So you have a paradigm of very intense sport competition that becomes very dominant within bodybuilding in the 70s and 80s. So the use of drugs is seen as a kind of doping that, that athletes, so bodybuilders see themselves as athletes, and they think, okay, so to increase our human performance, we just have to use these drugs the same way that weightlifters or track and field athletes are using them. And with steroids in particular, I attempted with colleagues of mine at Aarhus University to also produce a perspective for the present. So we had different data sets of in-depth interviews with people that are currently using steroids. And what we had observed, and that's something that other researchers had done that in the past, that there's a lot of variation. So people use them for different purposes, in different contexts, in different social environments. But what we tried to do with that specific attempt was to try and theorize and see whether we could kind of cluster some of these characteristics and then come up with some almost ideal types, so to speak, of users. So things such as we were looking at different motivations, different kinds of practices, so not just the drug use, but also the other things related to the drug use, for example, training or nutrition in the case of bodybuilding. The different approaches to the drugs, so some of the users had a very sophisticated approach, so they would read a lot of expert information, they would first talk to a lot of insiders to figure out what the drugs are for, what are the risks involved, how you should use the drugs to get the maximum benefits with the least risks, and so on and so forth. But we also had spoken to users who just wanted to try the drugs just because their friends did. And they had a very non-sophisticated approach to them. They were pretty clueless about dosages, about safety, about modes of administration. And that also related to the social environments, but also to the identities that people formed around their drug use. So there was a whole continuum from people that just use it for recreational almost purposes to people who identified as elite sportsmen, and they were using the drugs, as I said before, as a kind of very instrumental way for reaching their sport-specific goals. Okay, so that's a bit of background so far for my previous research, and that's how I kind of became interested in microdosing. I was interested in psychedelics before that for other reasons, but then, well, I was interested in mysticism, in fact, and the more I was reading about mysticism, the more literature on psychedelics I was accessing around mystical experiences. But eventually I came across, in the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of talk and reports on microdosing. And some initial observations was that the way it's framed as a multi-enhancer of sorts. So people talk about how microdosing psychedelics such as LSD or magic mushrooms enhances their cognitive abilities, enhances their mood, enhances their capacity to relate to people, their empathy, and some people even report physical improvements. And interestingly, there are also discussions on YouTube and online fora from bodybuilders who discuss microdosing for their gym practice. So there's this discourse that's emerging now about how microdosing is a more natural way of being more focused during your training in the gym, which will theoretically produce more results. So instead of using other substances, nutritional supplements or other drugs to get more focused in the gym, people are now talking within the gym communities about how microdosing could help them in a more natural way have the same effects. And then, of course, the place of microdosing in the context, in the context of what people call psychedelic renaissance. So that was interesting in terms of how psychedelics are being framed or reframed now as a field with different stakeholders coming in and the way they put forth different assessments of risk, how they discuss and frame different identities, or a lot of debates around expertise. So microdosing, at least in the way that we now discuss it, of course, people have done important work showing that microdosing actually is not as new as we now think, but certainly the trend of microdosing that we see in the media is relatively new, is within the last 4 or 5 years. And then, of course, there's a lot of public debates around drug use and policy reform, and of course a lot of media attention around psychedelics, which again kind of reminded me some of the media attention for anabolic steroids. And again, this kind of almost the same narrative as these weird drugs that started being used within specific subcultures but are now being diffused in wider populations and used for different purposes. What I mentioned before was what kind of sparked my interest, and I could see some relation to my previous work. And I thought human enhancement drugs and the theories around human enhancement drugs are perhaps an interesting way of thinking about microdosing psychedelics in the present moment. So these are some of the research questions that are driving me at the moment. So for example, to what extent, in what ways could we think of microdosing within a human enhancement drugs paradigm? What is its place in the immediate context of the psychedelics renaissance? And how does it speak to wider social and cultural phenomena and processes? So these are kind of large sociological questions that may be of interest to some people, maybe not to others, but I find them interesting. And part of that would be one way of approaching some of these questions would be to look at media representations as one kind of very visible, and specifically when it comes to mainstream media, one kind of very visible public discourses around the phenomenon. And why would that be significant to explore? I think because it kind of produces a frame for a relatively new phenomenon, again, in the way that I'm kind of defining microdosing as a trend now. But also because they create expectations, and of course other people like Torsten Passi have discussed that in their work, how media reports create certain expectations in users or potential users of the drugs. And that's particularly relevant for microdosing, where placebo effect is quite a big issue. Okay, because microdosing is about using doses that are that small where you can barely feel the results. So the placebo effect is a very real probability in this case. So methodologically, what I did was to look at what I thought was a representative sample of very mainstream magazines such as Rolling Stone, Forbes, Playboy, Men's Health, Marie Claire, which I really liked. I'll give you some examples later on. And so they have kind of significant readership in terms of the amounts of people that they reach, but also they're kind of established also in their genre. And they also have an international reach. So these were some of the selection criteria that I used, and I thought they're kind of representative of what we would call as a mainstream report on that issue. So certain of the things to explore from this perspective were kind of recurring themes in these reports, and how user profiles and identities are being construed, what are the kind of common narratives and vocabularies that are being used to talk about microdosing, and what are the alignments with other cultural processes. So where does microdosing fall in relation to other things going on that you could also call trending, for example. So some of the recurring themes in the different articles that I read have to do with, of course, the benefits and risks of microdosing, and especially the earlier articles were kind of not talking about risk that much. I think the more recent articles are beginning to recognize, perhaps because also research is getting more detailed about that, about the potential risks of microdosing, and then also the illegality of the practice is a recurring theme. Questions around expertise, so there's this big question mark of where to go to get proper information about microdosing. Who are the real experts in what seems to be this kind of new trend? Questions around self-identity when it comes to descriptions of users, of microdosers, and their life context. So where does their microdosing practice fit within other things that are going on in their lives, which I think is very interesting. So some of the things that kept coming up quite regularly in terms of the other cultural processes or phenomena was this kind of discourse around natural or alternative medicine and therapy. And again, here you have a kind of constant juxtaposition to the pharmaceutical industry, to big pharma. Okay, so again, psychedelics as a way of people, and I'm coming to my last point, of perhaps self-medicating and taking care of themselves for a whole continuum that ranges from enhancement to therapy. So people are trying to treat or self-treat mental health issues, depression, anxiety, by using psychedelics in very small dosages. But there's also this frame of biohacking and self-optimization. So how can you tweak the different capacities of your body, your brain, to become better in your relationships, better in your work, at your work, being more productive, more efficient. In terms of the profiles of microdosers and microdosing that kept coming up in these different magazine articles that I was accessing, was an interesting description of how people are actually microdosing. So what are the characteristics of the users themselves and how they approach the practice. So there was a lot about being very measured in their practice, being very sophisticated, being well-read, trying to research as much as they could, risk-averse, So there's an emphasis on that, and also being goal-oriented. So they had very specific things in their lives that they wanted to work on, whether that was, their job or their personal relationships, or perhaps some mental health issues that they've had. So they were using microdosing not just to experiment or for recreational purposes, but because they wanted to address in this kind of very systematic, rational way whatever they wanted to address. And in that context, microdosing was always framed as a kind of little help. Okay, so you just do different things to help yourself either get better or enhance the different abilities that you have. And so the same way, for example, I'm coming to my last point now, the same way you would do yoga or mindfulness, meditation, or engage in natural therapy, you also, or take care of your diet, you also take small doses of microdosing. So it becomes a little aspect of a much larger framework of practices. Okay, so it's not this big thing that will change your life from one day to the next. It's not about extreme changes. It's about very imperceptible changes that make you function better on an everyday basis. And much of that narratives were framed through juxtapositions to other ways of, for example, using psychedelics. So there are a lot of references in the reports that I'm discussing now about using psychedelics with much larger doses. So these are typically spoken as this kind of very wondrous but also very risky experiences. Okay, and you have a lot of examples there, but the narrative typically goes like, okay, I tried microdosing, but I didn't see God. I didn't talk to God. I didn't have this out of this world experience. I just felt a little bit. So there's always this kind of indirect or direct juxtaposition to other ways of using psychedelics. So there's kind of boundary work, I think, here. And again, references back to the 60s and 70s and the hippies culture and that experimentation with psychedelics that was in a very different context, of course. Now I'm going to present some quotes that I found. So I'm coming to Marie Claire magazine here. This is an excerpt from an article, Why Power Women Are Microdosing LSD at Work. That's wrong there, down there, that's 2016, the year of that publication. So the way that article was put together, it had the voices, it presented the voices of different users that ranged from, your regular friend next door to people that were kind of more well established and recognized. So this was one of the women featured in that article that have experienced microdose. I'm going to quickly read that for you. So Smith was a data scientist, said, along with shaking off those winter blues, Smith, became very, very efficient. It gives you fresh eyes for programming or figuring out algorithmic stuff. It made me really productive in a motivated way, which is nice language to use. Plus, during her 4-month-long mushroom experiment, which she in fact did with her husband, she got a lot of household chores done. Interestingly, the article began with the two of them, husband and wife, doing the microdosing experiment together. Thank you. But there was no mention, the guy suddenly disappears when the discussion comes to doing chores. So I thought that was interesting. And then farther down in the article, the reporter says the women who try microdosing aren't burnouts. In fact, the ones we spoke to are high achieving and interested in becoming more so. So there's something there about female subjectivity that I thought was quite interesting. The second person that the article was reporting on, who was more well-known, a writer and former lawyer, Ayelet Waldman. So here's the quote: Waldman was thrilled with the results. She regulated her own moods better and worked through marital bumps more easily. Her children, whom she told only that she was trying a new medication, gave her experiment glowing reviews. So there's something about motherhood going on here. And that's her own words. I didn't fly off the handle as much, she says. I wrote a whole book called Bad Mother. If I had been microdosing back then, I probably would have written Remarkably Calm, Compassionate Mother. So again, that was interesting in how microdosing becomes part, of a kind of larger discourse about identities or gender identities and what it means to be a woman in the present moment. And the third figure in that narrative was Dean, a saleswoman. So while Dean didn't experience the miracle of hyperfocus, which is again one of the kind of like holy grail in terms of the purported benefits of microdosing, it did help her at work, which was sales. Dean says that the mushrooms helped her switch personas as needed. Without consciously realizing it, she became girlier and sweeter when trying to sell to an older man, for instance. When I'm microdosing, I'm more creative, she explains. I read people better. It gives me a broader range of compatibility. I think it's a kind of interesting, I can't say I've analyzed this in great depth, but it's very interesting the language here around managing oneself and in the process also being better able to manage other people and how they relate to other people. And some interesting vocabularies that I saw being used again and again in the talk around psychedelics. So you have the IT language, for example. Microdosing is like defragging your computer, but for your brain or soul. You also have popularized discourses of neurobiology. And that's another quote there. So again, you see the juxtaposition with other ways of using psychedelics. So unlike other trending hallucinogenic experiences, like say drinking ayahuasca, microdosing doesn't deliver an earth-shattering, body-wrenching, mind-blowing journey through the other side of the doors of perception. The idea is to change in an almost imperceptible way your everyday neural functioning for the better. And again, I think this 1 minute left, okay. This neuro discourse is something that we come across, very often on reportings about many different and diverse practices that we see today. It's a way of understanding our practices. And there's also a lot of a language around psychotherapy that comes out, I think, of traditions of psychotherapy and healing. So Mercedes, who was a yoga instructor, says microdosing combined with other self-care practices such as yoga and mindfulness has been transformative. She points to a recent trip she took to London that triggered feelings of overstimulation and exhaustion. Some of you may recognize that. How I would have handled, oops, did I do that? Oh, that was, okay. How I would have handled that in the past was to drink or distract myself. So again, you have the juxtaposition with other ways of dealing with things, and some of them have also to do with drug use or other kinds of substance use. But I didn't do that. Instead of dwelling on my issues for weeks and succumbing to obsessive thoughts, I processed my emotions and let them go in a few hours. I think I'll stop here. I don't think I have any other slides. That's not. Yeah, I'll stop here. And thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions you have at the end.